Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's Governance, Policy, and Advocacy Committee. My name is Michael Cole, Columbus City School Board member and co-chair. So glad to have you all here today. I do apologize for somewhat of a late start. It seems as if the COVID bug has gotten a few folks, and I'm hoping that everybody is well and healthy and recovers in a good way. With that in mind, today, because we do not have a quorum, I wanted to prepare and do something unique today. But before I talk about that, why don't we just identify, if we can take a quick roll call, Mr. Barnes, who is here? All right, we've got Kelsey walking in. Good morning. Okay, so we can just make a quick roll call.
Chairman Brown, Vice Chair Cole,
Present.
Dr. Pierce, Joel Klein, Francis Beasley, Kelsey Ellingson, Jared Holt, Emily White. We have 3 members who are present in person, therefore there is no quorum which would be needed to vote on any matters. However, the committee is still permitted to continue any discussions that it may have. I'd also like to note that member Joel Klein and member Francis Beasley are participating via Zoom.
Thank you, Mr. Barnes. All right. With that, you'll have to pardon also the absence of Chair Eric Brown. He is enjoying himself in the wonderful West Indian shores of Jamaica. So I wish he and his family all the best on their trip out there. Today's going to be a little different. Today I wanted us to have the opportunity, because we won't be able to finalize and push forward the public comment policy, which is in practice well underway. But I want to make sure that in the future, for a future meeting, that we're able to do that. Secondly, cover a sexual harassment policy as well that will just be inclusive of federal requirements. But outside of that, we're looking forward to doing that in a future meeting. Today is the opportunity to get you all acquainted with the governance model, policy governance model that we are looking to adopt, or have adopted, quite honestly, and being trained in as we speak. We have joining us today AJ Crable and Ashley Paz from the Council of Great City Schools. Council of Great City Schools is a conglomerate, and I'll let AJ talk a little bit more about that, but a partnership that we've been a part of for some years now. We have gleaned incredible information from this organization. They're a research-based organization that is a collaborative of some of the largest school districts in the country, a little over 20 of them in the country. So we've had the opportunity to do professional development with this group, travel with this group, and do great work throughout the United States. I'm excited that he's here today, along with his team, to talk to you about this new governance model that we're looking to adopt. AJ, are you with us?
Good morning.
Good morning, good sir. Good morning. So I'll hand the ball right on over to you, and you can start your presentation.
Excellent. Thank you for having us. Ashley, you want to introduce yourself?
Hello, good morning, AJ, and good morning to our esteemed board members at Columbus City Schools. I'm Ashley Paz. I am a recently retired school board member from Fort Worth, Texas, and I'm excited to be joining the Columbus team to support you through your governance journey.
My name is AJ Crable. I'm former school board member in Kansas City, Missouri, and like Ashley, excited about being able to work with other school boards, large urban districts around the country, and supporting them and becoming intensely focused on improvements in student outcomes. As it turns out, there is research that speaks to what are behaviors that school boards can engage in that have a larger leverage impact on improving student outcomes, and what are behaviors that boards can engage in that are less so. So as an example, or as an analogy, when you think about classrooms, there are some behaviors that teachers can engage in that have a stronger relationship with improving student outcomes, and some behaviors that teachers can engage in that have a less significant impact. And so a large part of what professional development focuses on is how to help teachers identify what are the behaviors that we can engage in the classroom. They're going to have the biggest impact on our students. Similarly, our conversations are with boards. What are the behaviors that school boards can engage in that have the biggest positive impacts on the learning and education and well-being of their students? And so the work of the council over the past decade or so has included intentionally learning the research and in many cases capturing the research, really looking at what are the behaviors that make a difference, and then simply sharing those behaviors. And that's been the nature of our work with Columbus. It won't surprise folks the behaviors that stand out at the top. None of this is people ever find surprising. At the top of that list is, have we actually, as a school board, listened to our community sufficient that we've found what are the most priority items that the community wants students to know and be able to do? What are the goals for the school system? It tends not to surprise people that that's at the top of the list of what are the behaviors that boards can engage in. You can actually listen to their communities and identify and codify the goals for the school district. Similarly, it doesn't tend to surprise most folks that at the top of that list is actually monitoring progress relative to those goals. Most folks who've ever done anything worthwhile know that having goals doesn't actually secure anything for you. Actually monitoring those goals and making sure that we're making progress toward them. And so these are two examples of things that are really high on the list of what is it the boards can do that can make the biggest difference for students. And so this is a lot of our work across the country, is just identifying what are these common sense things, and sometimes not so common, but for the most part, common sense things that school boards can do that can really make the biggest difference for children. So before we dive into that, let me just stop for a minute and just open the floor. Any questions or reflections? Questions that folks have, for Ashley and I about, the work that we're doing with other school districts, the work we're doing with Columbus, or what I just described about this relentless focus on what are the behaviors that school boards can engage in that have the largest positive impact on students. Any questions about that before we dive in?
Good morning. I'm Kelsey. Good to see you. I would just wonder if you have any examples you could either share now or follow up with about a novel approach you're seeing to putting that into action.
So we actually provide what we hope is not for much longer a approach that is gaining speed, but is in some parts of the country still novel. This idea of boards taking the time, identify goals, monitor results, align resources with those, communicate progress. Unfortunately, those behaviors are still a little bit novel in large parts of the country. And so we run across a lot of boards that haven't adopted any goals whatsoever. So you ask them, what is the community most want students to know and be able to do it, and how are you focusing on that? And you get a bunch of blank stares around the boardroom table. That is sad, but that is still unfortunately common. Or we run across boards who they have adopted goals, but they don't know what they are. And so really the superintendent adopted goals and the board just said, yeah, sure, that sounds good. But the board members, it's not actually a reflection of the community's values, because the board members don't know what they are. They were crafted by staff, not by the board. And that's problematic because it's the board's job to represent the community, not the superintendent's. And then we run across other boards that have goals and they can tell you what they are. And their goals are, we want to have really great facilities, and we want to have new uniforms for the band and for the football team, and we want teacher to be happy and have a balanced budget and parents to be happy. Those are our goals. And then we start to ask them, well, what do those describe what students would actually know or be able to do? And we've literally had board members argue and say, well, wait a minute, students, that's not our job as a board, that's the superintendent's job. Like we don't have anything to do with student learning. And that also is incredibly sad, but it's common. And then finally, even when you do find the rare board, the incredibly unicorn-ish board that has been thoughtful about going out and listening to its community and gathering what's the vision of the community is, they've codified that vision into a set of smart goals about what students should know and be able to do, and all the board members actually know what they are. Even then, it's incredibly rare to find boards that are then systematically putting systems of monitoring in place where they're actually looking at those goals on a monthly basis to identify, are we actually making progress in reality, or is this just a bunch of talk among the adults? And so that monitoring piece is completely absent in most places. And even folks who have been responsible put goals in place, rarely is it they actually come back on a systematic, routine level. They actually monitor, are we making progress, or do we just say it and that therefore it must be so? And so unfortunately, the thing that we're describing still manages to be novel. However, our aspiration is that through our work, part of our passion is that we've been able to be a blessing to the children in our own communities on this work, and that's part of what fuels our energy to share this work across the country with others. It's because we don't want this to be novel. This should just be the norm. It should be normal that people are listening to their communities, writing down their goals, and monitoring progress toward them. But it's not yet. Not yet. Right now, and across the state of Ohio, you all are probably one of the few districts that is at the front of this work. Certainly my aspiration is that through the work in Columbus, that the rest of the state, will be blessed, that you all will be the city on the hill, so to speak, from a governance perspective, identifying what is highly effective governance that's intensely focused on student outcomes. What does that actually look like, and be a model for others? That being said, this work, more specific to your inquiry, this work is being practiced by districts all across the country, but it's still relatively new. We really started down this path, and Ashley and I were part of a team that really started this journey back in 2014, and have really only refined it in the last 5 or 6 years to the point of where it is today. And so this is still new. We think of this as still being the front edge of a revolution in school board governance, and moving from an adult-focused worldview of governing to a student outcomes-focused worldview of governing.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, AJ. Are there any other questions, insights? All right. I'll just offer one in terms of insight. This work has been tremendously valuable for us. There are certain ways in which we understand that this modeling, this paradigm, is not a one-size-fits-all piece. My aim specifically as a board member is not only to adopt it, but figure out where we tweak it in instances of nuance within our organization. So there are, unfortunately, because of state regulation, because of federal things, there are more often than not times where we are dealing with adult-focused pieces. But that we've been able to, in this experience and in this work with the council, we've been able to really better frame our student outcome focus and really drive the administration, not just on the superintendent side, but even on the fiscal side, the treasurer side, to figure out how we prioritize financially and build capacity for, on the superintendency side, to ensure the student outcomes, the type of children, the type of product that we want to produce in our young people. So thank you again, AJ. I look forward to this presentation.
So we're going to walk through 4 key learnings from the work that we've done. We've already mentioned all 4, and I've already dug a little bit into the first 2. But I'm going to walk through 4 key learnings that we've had while doing this work over the last 6 or 7 years now. So the first of those learnings is the board needs to set priorities. That's, again, not particularly surprising. We say it a little bit differently in practice. We say the board needs to represent the vision and the values of the community. And we distinguish those as two entirely separate things. The vision of the community is a type of priority that says, what do we want students to know and be able to do? The values of the community is a type of priority that says, what are the non-negotiables that need to be true while we're pursuing the vision? But both of these are community priorities. And so they need to come from the community. These aren't just things that are made up, because they sound good. They actually need to reflect the vision and values of the community. And so that's the first step, is that the board identifies the priorities. The second step is the board monitors the priorities. Again, we'll come back and do a deeper dive into what we mean by monitoring as well. But if you want to see examples of it, this board has begun the process of practicing monitoring work over the past few months. So that's step number 2. So first, we set the priorities as a school board, then we monitor the priorities to make sure they're actually happening in reality. The third step is that we align the resources with the priorities. As a school board, it's not enough to be monitoring progress toward the priorities, but we also have to, in everything that we do as a governing body, we have to ensure that that work is aligning all of the district's resources. Most importantly, it's human resources. It's the talent, the gifts, and the capacities of the people in the system are the single most important resources that the school system has access to. But then secondarily, the financial resources as well. Absolutely critical to align those to the community's priorities. And then that's item number 3. And then the fourth thing is to communicate progress, communicate the results. Is that as the board has been governing on behalf of the community, on behalf of the community's vision and values, and the board's been monitoring progress, and the board's been aligning resources. But at some point, the board has an obligation to come back to that same community and say, here are the results that we've gotten on your behalf for your children and for the school system. And so that's item number 4, is communicating the results. So those are the 4 big buckets of work that we want to share with you briefly today. And then again, as we step into each one with a little bit more definition, at any time, just raise your hand. Michael, I can't really see everybody, and so just call it out if a hand goes up or somebody wants to jump in. This is a conversation, not a lecture, so jump in at any time that you want to bounce ideas around. And especially if you hear something that doesn't sound right to you, then reach in and challenge. Like that's absolutely the healthy nature of this dialogue. Is if someone's like, AJ, this idea of having goals and listen to the community, that just sounds wrong. Then say so. Like jump in and let's have that conversation. And we're happy to point you to resources and literature that you can read that validates the perspectives that we're offering you. Because we certainly don't encourage people to take us at our word. We encourage people to do their own homework and their own research. And there is a lot of it to be done, but we will gladly send you the reading list if you can dive in. And if you come to a radically different conclusion on any of these things than what we've shared, please let us know. We would love to hear a different take on the literature. But over the past 6 years, we have yet to hear something radically different than what we've been sharing. So those are the 4 big buckets. Let's dive right in. First is clarifying the priorities. So the job of the board is to represent the vision and the values of the community. The vision is what the community wants students to know and be able to do, and the board clarifies these in the forms of goals. These are SMART goals, goals that are specific, measurable, attainable, results-focused, time-bound. And they describe what are the highest priority areas of what the community wants students to know and be able to do. And we encourage boards to adopt between 1 and 5. Out of curiosity, why is it that we encourage the board, of all the hundreds of possible priorities for what the community might want students to know and be able to do, why is it that we only encourage boards to adopt between 1 and 5 of them?
Anyone? Well, we don't want to over encumber ourselves with things that we cannot achieve. We want to make sure our goals are comprehensive, and we want to make sure that they're, in that SMART factor, achievable. So when you set out, when you set out to accomplish 10 goals as opposed to 5, it just makes your work all the more difficult and in fact more scattered.
Yeah.
So yeah.
What's the benefit to the board of adopting 20 goals? Anybody? What would be the benefit to the board of adopting 20 goals?
Go ahead, Ms. White.
So what?
If you have 20 goals, that might be 20 different goals that folks in the community, it's of a priority to somebody in that community, and then you've got more constituent groups, more stakeholders who feel like their goal has been validated. Although, as you mentioned, there's also that tension between actually meeting them and having more.
Yeah. So you said it very clearly. The benefit to the board of adopting 20 goals is it's going to look good when it's re-election time. Children will suffer for your lack of discipline and your unwillingness to prioritize. But yeah, what's a little bit of student suffering as long as I get reelected? You need to be clear that the failed adult behaviors in governing have a basis in something. They wouldn't be around if they weren't accomplishing something for someone. Unfortunately, oftentimes that someone who is the beneficiary is the elected official and not actually the child. And so it is absolutely to the benefit of elected bodies to have, let's have 100 goals. Or as we often think, the Oprah approach to goal setting. You get a goal, you get a goal, everybody gets a goal. And this works well to help elected officials be popular, because then when people roll up on you at church on Sunday, it's like, hey, brother, y'all got a goal about this thing that's really important to me? Yes, sir, we do. And then when somebody rolls up on you at the grocery store Tuesday while you're looking for a non-squishy avocado, and somebody says, hey, this is important to me, do you have a goal? It's like, yes, ma'am, yes, we do. And you get to be popular, but your children suffer for your lack of discipline. The reality is that high-performance organizations are focused organizations. They're looking really at just 1 to 3 key things that they're trying to perform against. At absolute maximum, we say 5, but we really recommend 1 to 3 goals. And so that puts a priority on, are these the highest need, highest leverage areas? Like if we're only, of the 100 possible things that we could adopt goals about, if we're only going to adopt 1 to 3, are we picking the areas that address the highest needs of our students? And are we picking the areas that are going to have the highest leverage impact? That if we are successful in these 1 to 3 areas, there's going to be this cascading effect that lifts up all of our students, that does the most good for all of our students. And so that's a real challenge. And it requires a lot of listening to the community, which this board has done. And it requires a lot of data and analysis from the administration, which this superintendent has done. And so this is why we have 1 to 5 goals, preferably 3, 1 to 3, and some of the process it takes to get there. In addition to representing the vision of the community, the goals that the board writes down as goals, the board also needs to represent the values of the community, because it's not enough. The community is not going to simply be satisfied by saying, yes, these are the results we want for children. The community also has a vested interest in saying, there are some things that just unacceptable, that even if these worked to accomplish the goal, that they'd still be out of line. So if one of the goals is we want to see all 3rd graders, learn calculus, and some hotshot, person over at the university down the street figured out that if we drop 3rd graders on their head out of the 2nd story window at just this exact angle, that when they stand up and come back from the hospital, that they will all know calculus. Even if that turned out to be true, I think most people in the community would be like, nah, I don't want my 3rd grader to know calculus that badly. I'm like, we're not throwing them out a 2nd story window. Even if that would help us accomplish the goal, it's just still out of bounds. It's an unacceptable behavior that the organization can engage in. What this illustrates is this idea that even while the community has a vision for its students, it also has values that have to be honored on the journey to accomplishing that vision. And so that's also the job of the board, is to listen to the community. What are these non-negotiables? And again, to pick only between 1 to 5. So there's hundreds of values the community has, but the board has to identify what are the highest need, highest leverage values of the community that have to be honored on the way to accomplishing the vision. And the board adopts these values is what we refer to as guardrails. And these are 1 to 5 statements to describe what's out of bounds. What is the school system not allowed to do on its journey to accomplishing the goals? So for example, for Columbus, one of the examples of those is on the path to accomplishing the goals, the superintendent is not allowed to have children be unsafe. Let's see, actually pull, I'm sorry, that wasn't it. The one we talked about last night was not allowed to have staff who are culturally non-responsive. I'm sorry, that's what it was. Was that where we landed, Michael? It was they're culturally non-responsive? Yeah, that was it. Okay. So one of the examples of the values that this board listened to the community and said, even if we can improve student learning, like how we get there is deeply important to our community. And in particular, one area of that is that we can't do it in a way that's culturally non-responsive. And so the board, listening to all the different hundreds of ideas from the community about the highest need, highest leverage values, identified that as one of the 5 that they ultimately settled on as being one of the values that they were going to create a guardrail around. And so now they've created a framework and said to the superintendent, any decisions that you need to make that get us closer to the goals, but that don't violate the guardrails, that get us closer to the community's vision, but that don't violate the community's values. Any decision you need to make as a superintendent, we're going to back you on. But that's because we've created this tight framework in which you have to remain. You can't just go off and do anything. You have to do things as a superintendent that are explicitly designed to accomplish the vision, the goals, and that are explicitly designed to honor the values, the guardrails. This is what we mean when we say the first bucket of work is for the board to clarify the priorities. What questions do you have about the board's obligation to clarify the priorities, the first of these 4 buckets of work we're going to walk through? What questions do you have about this idea of the board clarifying the priorities?
What I appreciate most, I'm glad now my mic is working because I was trying to chime in. What I like about it makes it a little confusing in the work, but I like the fact is that we start from the standpoint of what we will not do, what we will not allow. So the way that this model works is that it's almost like a community organizer mindset. If you've ever worked with folks like that who are community organizers, they are very clear and definitive about what their agenda is, what their goals are, and how those goals fundamentally and strictly adhere to the needs of people. So they go out and survey what folks want and then design a model, design a agenda that is set specifically to advocate on their behalf. This paradigm gives us that opportunity to do that by saying the superintendent will not do this, that, and the third. So each goal has a general kind of heading. Our first goal is that, we'll commit to behavioral systems, and I'm not saying that fully correctly, but that we're gonna make sure that we support intervention systems within our district. Intervention systems that support behavioral needs, that intercede on behalf of social, emotional, and learning needs for our children, that we're going to commit to that. Then there is below that a subheading that says superintendent shall not or will not do something. And that strengthens exactly what it is that we're trying to do and makes us, as AJ says, more focused. Is there anybody online that has a question or wants to make a statement? I'm not sure if Dr. Pierce is on with us right now. Joellen, do you have any questions? Ms. Beasley, Lois?
No, I don't, but like you, I was really impressed by starting out with what will not be allowed. That kind of gives you a smaller window of things to work with when you start out with what will not be allowed. And I do like that community organizer focus.
Yeah, in what feels like a previous life now, I worked as a faith-based community organizer. And one of the key principles of community organizing is that you're supporting community leaders and organizing around their self-interest, and trying to identify what are those things that is most valuable to us as a community. What are the things that we value, and how do we go about ensuring that those values are being honored. And so this idea of saying anything that conflicts with these values is off limits. I share Michael's sense that matches heavily with the community organizing, the faith-based organizing tradition that I was trained in as well. Other questions or reflections, and certainly Ashley, always feel free to jump in with your expertise. Other questions or comments about this first bucket, that the board has an obligation to clarify the priorities. Anyone else before we move on to the second bucket?
Go on ahead.
All right. So where the first bucket is clarifying the priorities, what is the vision and values of the community that need to be codified into goals and guardrails? The second bucket of work, the second of four, is monitoring progress relative to those priorities, monitoring progress. So first, we clarify the priorities, then we monitor progress. The monitoring of the progress is absolutely essential, because just because we've said this should happen doesn't mean it's automatically going to happen. Or said differently, to quote a former president, trust but verify. Like it is not appropriate for the board to just blindly trust that staff is going to do the things that the board has said are the community's priorities. That is not appropriate. It's not appropriate to blindly trust. That instead, it's the obligation of the board on behalf of the community it serves to verify with a regular cadence to ensure that the vision and values of the community are actually being honored. And that verification process we refer to as monitoring, where they actually identify on a calendar, and this month we're going to look at this slice of our goals. At this month, we're going to look at this slice of our guardrails, and clarify that we want a report from the superintendent or from the appropriate administrator that describes the extent to which we have evidence that these goals and guardrails are actually being honored in reality. That it's never appropriate for the board to just blindly trust. They need to trust, but they also need to verify that that trust is being honored. Now, the way that works in reality is that the board needs to set aside a significant amount of its time. And this is where we find out which boards are actually deeply invested in the community's vision and values, and which boards are not. Because the boards that are deeply invested are boards that are going to spend at least half of their time monitoring that progress to figure out, are we actually on track? And then the other half of their time, all the other things that you heard Michael earlier mention, that there are state laws and federal laws and all these other requirements. And you spend half of your time making students the priority, and then the other half of the time doing whatever else the board feels like it needs to do. But with that half of the time that the board is investing in monitoring progress toward its goals, that is the information the board needs to make the other half of its time actually well spent. Because all the other stuff that you have to do, how do you know if what you're doing is actually lining up with what students need if you haven't actually spent time to figure out to what extent are students getting what they need? If you aren't doing the monitoring, you're making it up. And you're making it up as a board member is not honoring what children require. It's honoring what Facebook said or Twitter said or Instagram said, or what you made up on your own. Oh, well, I know all things because I got elected. No, you don't. the way that you know how to honor your obligation to children is you actually look at what is true and real for our children right now relative to the community's vision for our children, and then make decisions that continue to push the district in the direction of, are we actually accomplishing the things that this community wants us to accomplish on behalf of our children? But if you never stop to look at that data, then you're just making it up. Then children are being harmed by your arrogance. It's absolutely essential that boards invest the time to monitor progress, because that gives them the insight and the wisdom they need to actually then make decisions about what adults should and shouldn't be doing, and how dollars should and shouldn't be spent, and so on and so forth. The monitoring is the fuel for the rest of the decision making the board engages in. This is part of why monitoring work is so essential. I've seen too many boards who don't actually stop to check to figure out what's going on for children and what children need. It's really wind up making decisions based on what's popular with adults, not what's necessary for children. This is a recipe for failure. This is what we mean by monitoring, is to take time each month, half of the board's time each month, monitoring progress, looking at what is it that we've said that students should know and be able to do, and what evidence do we have of where they are relative to those expectations right now. And that should then inform, okay, so now we've got to decide whether or not to vote on this item. Well, what impact will this item have on this area where children are still struggling? Or maybe we're ahead of the curve in a particular area. What's been working, and will this item expenditure help accelerate the workability that our current students are currently experiencing? That's why the second piece of this is not, it's not the most social media friendly. It's not going to win you elections. It's not exciting. It's not sexy. It's just the hard work that improvements in student outcomes requires. Just the methodical monthly checking in to figure out what is the reality of students compared to the expectations the community has, and on a monthly basis, just checking the data. This is what we mean by monitoring progress relative to the goals, relative to the community's vision. What questions do you have about the second bucket, monitoring progress relative to the priorities?
Ms. White.
The second is monitoring. What questions?
I've got lots of questions, and I'm asking these questions as a community member of the board, not an elected member of the board. So
Yeah.
on this board, on this committee, we review and make recommendations on various policies, and so this is actually a place where the rubber hits the road on the monitoring, and we have had lots of policies. I'm thinking of like the equity policy that we workshopped for months, that ultimately, we decided to have a reporting component from the superintendent. We decide like what time of year would be most appropriate, what is the content of that data. But I guess what I'm curious about is, for that monitoring, what kind of best practices would you recommend for what form that monitoring should take? Should it simply be saying the superintendent shall report, or are there other bodies or sources of data or information that you think are also effective? Or is this really something where the board is just saying, superintendent, you take this policy and run with it? Should there be more detail, more guidance? Are there substantive measurements that should be included as a best practice to make sure? I mean, I get that some of that's going to be guided by what type of policy are you considering and what are the goals of that policy. But
so this is a great inquiry. Most of what you will hear us talking about with the board is really focused on monitoring reports that are coming to the board from the administration. But that's, to your point, not the only type of monitoring that takes place in a healthy organization. So for example, each year, the board, rather than receiving an internal monitoring report about finances, each year the board also receives an external monitoring report about finances. Anybody know what we call that?
the results of the levy?
Happens every single year. The board receives a monitoring report about finances, but not from internal to the organization, from external to the organization. Anybody know what we call that report that happens every single year?
Is it a report card?
election.
Of sorts,
State audit.
your annual audit.
Ah,
Your annual audit is a form of monitoring that's looking at the performance of the organization financially and regarding financial controls. But unlike other monitoring reports that are coming from internal to the organization, that's an example of a monitoring report that's coming from external. You have external auditors coming in and doing this evaluation. And so to your inquiry, yeah, it's entirely appropriate to have a mix of both internal and external auditing taking place. Um, Recently, I think you all requested a external report from the council. I can't remember, was it in HR? What was, there was some type of report that you all requested and the council produced for you. This is a fairly common thing that the council does.
HR, AJ.
It was HR?
Yes, it was.
And so in that instance, what happened is you all called a third-party group external to your organization and said, could you come and produce for us a report that gives us some insight into this particular area of our operations? And that, again, I would describe as an external monitoring report rather than an internal one. And so, yes, it's entirely appropriate for the board to have a mix of the two to help triangulate performance. You also, but some of this happens every year. So you get external monitoring report every year from the state about academics. You get an external monitoring report every year in finance from your auditor. And so, state by state, there are other external monitoring reports that happen every single year. But yes, if this body said, in addition, each year we want or maybe every third year, we want a third party evaluation of how we're doing regarding our equity programming and our equity initiatives. Then in addition to the annual reporting that you get from the administration, every third year, then you'd have a third party come in from the outside and do an evaluation. That type of design around monitoring, totally appropriate.
so so where we put that into practice was not only just in that request to the council for the HR side, we solicited Phi Delta Kappa, PDK, to come in and look at our entire operation and help us get that external look as to where we have those strengths, weaknesses, where are opportunities and threats that exist. They gave a very thorough look, and there were some things that we surmised out of that have helped guide our path to thus to this day. AJ, there's something else, though, on the monitoring piece that you somewhat alluded to, but I'd like you to give clear idea to that. I think that'll help answer some thoughts that they might have. We have a rubric, so to speak, a qualitative kind of group of assumptions that help us guide and frame, in fact, how we monitor. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the monitoring guide that this board relies upon, there are a few different components that are worth highlighting, and we could certainly get community members copies of that document. But there's a progress monitoring guide that the board's been using. So there are a few key elements. One key element is that it insists that boards spend the majority of their time in the monitoring conversations. Say we're monitoring third grade literacy. That if we're going to spend an hour monitoring third grade literacy, that we would generally encourage the board to spend somewhere between 35 and 45 minutes of its time really investigating and inquiring into where are we at right now and how did we get here. And then once there's incredible clarity around where are students at right now and what caused us to get here, what's the root cause, what is the deep analysis that helps inform why we are where we are, then spend the small remainder of the time in a conversation around, okay, so now what are we going to do next? This is the opposite approach that many boards take that kind of lack discipline and perspicacity, is that they spend all their time talking, okay, so things are bad, what are we going to do about it? But having a conversation that's grounded in what are we going to do about it doesn't enforce a sense of discipline in your administration to make sure they actually understand what's going on. Answers without clarity around circumstances tend to be wrong. Like, your analysis has to be informed by what is currently true in the moment. And that needs to be a deep analysis, not a shallow analysis. And so it's for that reason that in the rubric that the board uses, there's this real emphasis on spending 2/3 or 3/4 of your time focused on where are we at right now and how did we get here? There's a quote that's often attributed to Einstein. I'm pretty certain that's not accurate. But it basically says, if I got 20 minutes to solve a problem, I'm going to spend 15 minutes defining the problem and understanding the problem. The last 5 minutes, then, creating a solution to it. We take a similar approach. It's kind of like in carpentry. Measure twice, cut once. What you don't do is you grab the board, you grab the saw, and you just start hacking at it. And then after you've cut it, it's like, all right, so does this fit what we need? That's not the optimal way to serve children. The other thing that's in that rubric, as you look at it, again, we can provide copies, is it really obligates the board to use this as an opportunity to evaluate the strength of its own monitoring by going through a brief evaluation at the end of monitoring sessions to figure out, did we actually focus on the things we wanted? Did we focus mostly on looking backwards and understanding where we are currently? And then after we did that, then we transitioned to looking forward. Did we focus on data that's existing in reality rather than showing up with opinions that we've heard on social media? Were we actually guided by the evidence rather than guided by our opinions? Did we focus on getting clarity about what the superintendent and our staff believe are the solutions rather than spending all the time trying to give our own solutions? Do we make it a formative evaluation of the superintendent rather than an advising session, for the superintendent? And so all of these are evidence-based practices around formative evaluation of chief executives and monitoring of performance that have been codified into a rubric that the board self-evaluates against on a regular basis to figure out how are we getting stronger and stronger and stronger at the practice of monitoring student outcomes.
Thank you for that. Are there any questions thus far?
Any questions about the second bucket of monitoring progress before we move on to the third bucket? Yeah, Ashley, so you've obviously done some of this work, not only in Fort Worth, but then as you've been supporting other districts around the country. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, of course. So I would like to just briefly mention my experience as actually having gone through the process of implementing this type of work. And that, this is something that AJ knows, and this is something that Committee Chairman Cole knows. I am a huge nerd when it comes to a need for data. So, whenever you receive those monitoring reports as an elected official, as someone who is responsible to reporting back to the community and having these conversations about how we can do better, I definitely understand the need to educate your constituency, and these monitoring reports are just the way to do that. And also the calendar that you even schedule your reports out in. If I have a constituent that's on the phone with me and says, oh, well, I heard that graduation is down this by 4%, and this is the lowest our graduation rates have ever been, then I can actually look to my monitoring calendar and say, oh, actually, we received a report about 3 months ago, and I can forward you that report, and I can send you the video that talks about it. We actually don't have graduation rates that are down. We're up at an all-time high. So it is one way to kind of combat some misinformation by actually putting what is actually happening onto the record and having it, having the conversation about it in public. So transparency can actually be politically beneficial as long as you are approaching it with integrity like this.
Yeah.
Thank you for that, Ashley.
Other questions or reflections on the second point of the board monitoring progress before we move on to the third bucket? All right. So the first bucket is clarify the priorities. This is in listening to the community to identify the vision and values of the community and codify them as goals and guardrails. The second bucket is monitor progress. This is monitoring progress toward the priorities to ensure that they're being executed in reality, that children are benefiting in reality, not just in opinion. The third bucket and I know we're running short of time, so I'll try to pick it up a little bit. The third bucket then is, are we aligning resources? And what we mean by that is, are we, now that we've identified what the priorities are and we have systems in place to monitor them, are we effectively using those priorities to inform alignment of everything else we do? And some of the key examples of what we mean by aligning resources, one of those is a superintendent evaluation. If the board has said that these goals and guardrails represent the vision and values of the community, then are the goals and guardrails the basis for superintendent evaluation? If they are, then that's creating alignment of expectation within the organization. If they're not, then we're actually creating non-alignment. We're actually decreasing the likelihood that the community's vision and values are attended to. That's an example of what we mean by alignment. Are we causing everyone's attention to be focused in the same way? Are all of the adults in the canoe rowing in the same direction? And the more things that the board does to cause that, the more acceleration we get on behalf of the students that we serve. And so one key area of that is the superintendent evaluation. What often happens is that, school boards, they want to, whatever the latest thing you've heard out in the community, well, that's what we're going to evaluate the superintendent on. I recently worked with the school board, and literally one of the items in their intended evaluation was, well, the superintendent, he doesn't stay till the end of the football game. Like he's left at halftime, at a number of the football games. Obviously, he doesn't care about the children. And so we need to mark him down as evaluation.
Columbus City
Friends,
schools.
This is some foolishness, y'all. But unfortunately, it's normal foolishness. It describes a preoccupation with appearances over the reality for students. And so that behavior, in addition to glorifying appearances rather than realities, also has a negative effect of drawing the superintendent's attention away from the goals and guardrails. So now they know, oh, okay, so even if I accomplish the goals and guardrails, that's not what they actually care about. What they actually care about is, am I making them look good with their constituents? Okay, so what I'll do is I'll spend all my time making them look good with their constituents, so that way I'll secure my job. And in that context, even if we don't hit the goals and guardrails, they'll be okay with that as long as I, stuck around for all the football games and praised the board members while I was there. Like you want to be clear that what you measure as a board has massive cultural influence on the organization. And that if you really want to organize the culture of the organization around a focus on student outcomes, then you have to organize your evaluation of the superintendent around the same. Because wherever your attention floats away from that, the attention of the organization will begin to float in that direction as well. And so that's one example of aligning the resources. Another obvious example of aligning the resources is the annual budget. If the board approves the annual budget without rock solid confidence that the primary focus of resource allocation is accomplishment of the goals, then the board has done its students a powerful disservice. So what often happens when it comes time to budget is board members sit around and like, well, here are all the ththings that I've heard, lately that people are concerned about. Did we cover these things? And well, and Mr. Johnson, did he get a job? And Ms. Jackson's company, did she get a contract? And these are the types of things that begin to preoccupy the minds of elected officials when it's time to adopt a budget. And it's this obsession with adult needs and adult focus and adult concerns. Instead, the board that wants to really align the resources is paying almost no attention to the adult matters and is first focused on, what evidence do you have, Madam Superintendent? What evidence do you have, Mr. CFO, that this budget is making its first priority for resource allocation accomplishment of the goals? And we actually go so far as to suggest that the board's default position should be one of skepticism, that you should come into that conversation assuming that the budget is in fact not aligned with accomplishing the goals. And it's the job of the CFO and the superintendent to convince the board, and the board shouldn't come in prepared to be convinced. The board should come in with a skeptical mind. Like, I don't believe that these resources are aligned. Prove to me that they are. And inside of demanding evidence and proof from the administration, that the budget is in fact aligned with the goals. That's how you get the budget to in fact be aligned with the goals. But if the board doesn't push for that, then it's less likely to happen. So that's a second example of what we mean by the board, once it's prioritized, identified the priorities and has begun monitoring the priorities. The third bucket of work is that it needs to align resources with those priorities. What questions do you have about this third bucket of work, the board aligning resources with the vision and values of the community? What questions do you have about this?
Before I go to Ms. White, I'd like to see if there's anybody on line here who has a question as well. I want to make sure I don't miss you all. Okay, Ms. White.
Sure. So thank you for all. I mean, these are really insightful discussions about best practices. I guess what I'm wondering here on this committee, which for the most part has worked on drafting rules for policies, and now the aspiration is that it'll work more on governance. Is this process that you're describing more of like a state of mind or a series of values for best practices, or is it something that can be actually reduced to writing in a policy, in rules that can guide the decision-making process on all kinds of things?
Yeah, so once the board has its goals and guardrails in place, that should be its decision-making rubric for every single decision. So, for example, if this committee continues to exist, anything you do going forward should be intentionally designed to be in alignment with the goals and the guardrails that were adopted. And so rather than developing policies or ideas or more documentation about whatever it is that each committee is assigned to do, but doing so kind of in a vacuum, the source document for the committee's work should always be the goals and the guardrails. And figure, okay, so where are we experiencing non-alignment with the goals and guardrails, and what is our committee's role in causing there to be alignment for the area that for which we've been given stewardship. And so if there is a specific, so you have, and this concept of, equity shows up in one of the guardrails that's really looking at equitable distribution of resources, particularly financial. And so if I'm on this committee, I'm thinking, okay, what additional work needs to happen that the board owns to ensure that that's happening in reality? And then that becomes the center of you all's work. Well, what I wouldn't do is start somewhere other than the goals and guardrails, looking for things to do as a committee. Well, to be blunt, I'd probably start by dissolving the committee entirely. And then as issues come up of an equity sort that are in conflict with the goals and guardrails, I'd spin up the committee to specifically take on the challenge of, okay, why is this particular thing continuing to happen that is in violation of our guardrail number 3? And what's the board's role in doing something about that? Propose that action to the board, and then disappear again as a committee, and only come back and play episodically as is necessary to support the work of the board. Not this committee, to my understanding, does not exist, to manage the management team or to even to advise the management team, but rather to support the work of the board. And so that means anytime something's happening that appears to be in significant violation of the goals and guardrails, that is the kind of the equity team, that your job would be looking at it from the perspective of, okay, these equity expectations in the goals and guardrails are not being honored. What is the responsibility of the board to do about that? And you all would, put together the first draft of what might the board's responsiveness be to the reality that the goals and guardrails as they relate to equity are not being honored. But all that to say, that is the lens that I would encourage this committee to operate from, is starting with the goals and guardrails as your source document, identifying where those aren't being honored, from an equity perspective, and then proposing to the board, here's action that we propose that you all take to try to resolve this mismatch between the goals and guardrails that the board has written down and the reality that children are experiencing. And so that is the way that I would encourage committees like this to function, is that your source document for functioning is the goals and guardrails. And if you all are tasked with being kind of the equity observers of the goals and guardrails, then you're constantly looking at the performance of the district to figure out, is there an equity violation as it relates to accomplishment of the goals and guardrails? And if so, what advising do we provide to the board regarding what the board should do about that? That's what I would prescribe for this particular committee.
Any additional questions? And let me also kind of put this into perspective from our standpoint. Our organization is the operation of our work, of course, rests in what this board has designed and agreed upon with the superintendent and the treasury, all of our operations in terms of goals and then guardrails. The goals of what we're trying to achieve for ultimate student outcome, and the guardrails, the thou shalt nots of what the administration will adhere to. But I look much higher than that. We have a mission statement. This work directly aligns with that mission statement. And I would encourage anybody who's doing anything with Columbus City Schools to know our mission statement. Because if you do, then you'll be like, oh, wow, I see where the connecting dots are. We require that each student is highly educated, prepared for leadership and service, and empowered for success as citizens in a global community. That's our mission statement. This work directly aligns to that because, again, it is student focused. It is student outcomes focused. So I wanted today to make sure that you guys knew what we were doing and the direction that we're going with this governance model so that you see where there's synergy opportunity here. I see this committee is very valuable because it is our opportunity to continue to have community insight and feedback and involvement, engagement in our processes, particularly in this central role that we have as governance leaders in the organization, right? You get to participate in that side of it by what you offer and feedback and insight as we develop or revise policy. But you also get to help us, as AJ is alluding to some generative aspects as well. Generative aspects like, how are you monitoring your strategic plan? How exactly are you looking at your goals and guardrails and ensuring that there's alignment to what you set out to accomplish? Where are you as a board, getting off track, if at all? So this is one of the reasons why I wanted you guys to, get to learn about this governance model, get a sense of where we're going with it, and we can continue to evolve as GPAC. I call us GPAC now. I don't call us GPAC. I say GPAC. But how we evolve as this committee, it's very interesting, and then I'll get it back to AJ. It's very interesting how we started off. We started off as an organization that was, or as a committee that was more focused on, policy and compliance alignment to state law and federal law. That's how this whole thing started off. Okay, we're going to clean up our policies and revise them so that everything is fresh and correct on the books. Today, in alignment with what we're doing in this work, there's some additional stuff that actually make your work a lot more substantive and valuable to the organization. My vision is to see this thing, as co-chair, my vision is to see this thing evolve into something much more functional. So yeah, thank you for that, AJ.
Well, and I've got to jump in 10 minutes, but fortunately we're down to just one bucket left. And so where the first bucket is identify the priorities, the second is monitor the priorities, the third is align resources to the priorities. The fourth bucket of work is that the board then has obligation to communicate results about the priorities back to the school board's boss, which is the community. That in the same way that the board listens to the community to understand what the priorities are, it then has an obligation to close that loop by going back to the community to communicate, here are the results relative to those priorities. That, one of the most important things about that, this is not a dog and pony show. This is not a, let's sugarcoat this to make it sound good, so that we'll look good. This is, we have an obligation as employees of the community to tell them the straight, unvarnished truth about what is going on relative to the community's priorities. And so going back with a regular occurrence, actually building it into your monitor, into your calendar that says, just at these regular intervals, we as a board are going to report out to the community where we are relative to the goals, the community's vision, where we are relative to the guardrails, the community's values. And just to give the straight, undiluted, truth about here's where performance is. And the community deserves to know, do we have a board that has led in such a way that there's not been adequate focus, there's not been adequate alignment, there's not been adequate monitoring, and so there's been no progress made on our goals and guardrails? Or the community deserves to know that we have a board that has clearly identified the priorities, has effectively monitored those priorities, has aligned the resources to priorities, and as a result, we actually see some progress happening relative to those priorities. The community deserves to know, is this board effective or ineffective? And whether the board is effective or ineffective is in part measured by, are we actually seeing progress relative to the goals and guardrails? If we're not, the board is playing a role in its ineffectiveness of the organization. If we are, then the board is playing a role in the effectiveness of the organization. But either way, that should be reported out to the community. The community has a right to know, what is the performance for my children and what's the performance of the school system? And so that's what we mean by this fourth bucket of work, communicating the results, the good, the bad, and the ugly. What question do you have about this fourth bucket of work, communicating the results back to the community?
Anyone have any thoughts? Any reflection on it at all, just from the standpoint of what you appreciate in it or what you don't appreciate in it?
I mean, I appreciate all of it. I wear another hat that this is all really helpful for. And I think that, I mean, if you go back to just different philosophies on how you serve as an elected official or just as a public servant is do you get elected to go there and because the people have chosen you, they trust your judgment and your will is the right thing? Or is it that you are always the representative and you always need to loop back with the people who put you there and make sure that you're in constant alignment? I think most people here would fall in the latter camp, but you can unwittingly diverge from that. So I think having this process codified somewhere is a really valuable approach to making sure that we don't go astray. So I just thank you. This is really helpful. I've taken copious notes, and I just appreciate your time this morning.
Anybody online? Doc Pierce, anyone?
I see a hand going up. Yes, ma'am.
Francis Beasley. I also appreciate having an outline of the process. Being a fairly new member, having this outline explains and clarifies a lot of where we are going. I really appreciate the reliance on.
One of your devices might need to be muted.
Okay.
There you go.
The reliance on governance was explained and clarified very well for us. Governance and advocacy, and communicating the results to the community. So I really appreciate, as a new member, the clarification of these four goals.
Ms. White, do you have anything before we give AJ another minute and let him move on to his next meeting. And again, I thank you all so much for joining us and making this, I think, a very informative presentation, and more importantly, the members all the more richer in knowledge about who we are and what we do as a result.
I do
Yes.
have one question, and I'm sorry for all of my questions that are trying to get from the abstract to the hard particulars here. But I'm curious if you have any thoughts or best practices about particular forms of data or information or methods of communication that are important for the community. I'll just say for Columbus City Schools, some of the pieces that I find fascinating and interesting and are very easily available, in addition to like state report card data for what that's worth, are like the digital dashboard that our district has that shows real-time data on the demographics, the population, the attendance, and things like that on a school-by-school basis, on a daily basis. But at the same time, it's no secret that our particular district in the recent past has had integrity issues with the data that has been produced. And I know that those guardrails are always an important thing for our district at this point. But I'm just curious if you had any best practices for this reporting piece for key information or ways of distributing it that have been effective in other districts.
So there are two different pieces. When we talk about there being monthly monitoring reports, those reports are designed to be easily read and understood by any member of the community. You shouldn't have to have an education PhD to read them. And they are intended to be 1 to 5 pages max. And so those are by design a document that the board should be able to use to share updates with the community about the various goals, about the various guardrails. So when they're receiving a monitoring report, when you hear that term used, a monitoring report about the goals of the guardrails, you should automatically know it's going to be a 1 to 5 page document max, and it's going to be written in a manner that is intended to be fully accessible to any member of the community. And so that is by design a document that the board should be able to use to share. The other document that I would share with folks is the superintendent's annual evaluation. In most places, that winds up being a 1, maybe 2 page document that is a summary of the current state of performance relative to each of the goals and each of the guardrails. That fits on 1, maybe 2 pages. It's just a table that says, here's goal 1, and here's how we did on it. Here's goal 2, here's how we did on that. Here's goal 3, here's how we did on that. And having that document and just handing it to people and walking through it, I think is perfectly appropriate. To say, here is the vision and values that you've articulated to us and that we've written down as a board, and here's the data on each individual one of them of where we currently are as a district. And again, most of the time that superintendent evaluation, because it's just the amalgam of the results on the goals and the results on the guardrails, normally fits onto 1, at most 2 pages that then you could share with people and then walk through that data with them so that folks have an idea of where we are currently regarding the vision and values of the community. And by the way, please never apologize for wanting to dive into specifics about any of this work. It's not at all reasonable to expect that we'd get into that in the course of an hour, but it is reasonable to expect that whatever questions you have about that, we'll gladly get those answered for you, get you examples of documents, like I said, get you a reading list so you can do more reading to the extent that this is something of interest. Any other questions or reflections before we wrap up?
All right, it looks like there aren't any.
Ashley, any final words?
Just wanted to say thank you for all of the great questions, and this is exciting to be moving on to the next step with everyone in the room.
Well, and I join Ashley's gratitude of being included on this important journey that this board has been leading, and we stand ready to serve whenever called upon. Mr. Chair, back to you.
Thank you so very much, AJ and Ashley, for joining us. I think, again, this is just another right step in the right direction that is helping us become much more of a focused organization. There's some ways in which we have already had capacity and works in place to ensure that outcomes for students were met. But sometimes it's just about how you frame it. It's just about the types of goals and guardrails, even the addition of guardrails to this whole piece that makes our work all the more substantive. We prioritize this from and AJ, if you guys have to go, I understand. We prioritize this from a budget standpoint many years ago with the adoption of zero-based budgeting. And zero-based budgeting is a model that is more private sector utilized, but we've integrated it with public sector type things. What we do is we look at where the most effective aspects of education are in terms of what we're trying to do with our students, and then invest in those things that's working for our kids. A perfect example would be CGA. So for all our brothers and sisters who have schools, children in school in Columbus Gifted Academy, right? This is where we have prioritized that over the years on the finance side and on the academic side to ensure those students have what they need. And it's the same process that we'll follow in looking at other specialty programs and or traditional schools, whether it's CTE or whether it's, the many opportunities in traditional public school that we'll offer our students. We have to adopt to this also because the state, from their level of it, have created rich opportunities for students to have multiple diploma designations. CTE, Career Tech Ed, for example, a college prep diploma, right? Honors diplomas. There are all kinds of designations that we appropriate to students now that are not just relevant in terms of having a child graduate and finish their process with us, but also makes them workforce and college ready. Also helps them design their own narrative as to how they will present that diploma to a real world community. So these goals and guardrails that we've designed to that effect help students along each level of their grade band. We have goals and guardrails that are focused on, student literacy in each given phase of their academic development in the marathon to high school graduation. So at the end of the day, I love how this is all coming together. It's had its funny kind of stress points at times, particularly in the monitoring, because, and I'll use you for an example, Emily, you have a mind that, okay, I got this, now you're working on something else. You're seeing a little further down the road. Same with you, Kelsey. You are seeing something farther down the road. Well, then we're not really talking about that in the monitoring conversation. In the monitoring conversation, we're getting a presentation on what we've asked for. We're looking specifically at that data, and then based on those buckets of questions that help guide our monitoring discussion, this is where we're focused. It's weird because they really don't even want us to give, how can I say, direction to the superintendent during this monitoring piece. So we have to find these innovative ways to ask questions in a way that then communicates effectively to the administration and superintendent exactly what it is that we want. So we've been able to tell whether we've seen some measure of effectiveness and progress or not just by using that system. It's a little tricky at times, but we're trying to make it work. And that's where I said earlier, I think that it's just incumbent of us to figure out how we tease out certain things that work for us. I'm one of those people that, I'm kind of one of those Bruce Leonian folks who say, use what is most useful and discard what is not. I'm kind of that mindset. So I'm approaching this paradigm that same way. As we get to close out here, are there any closing thoughts? I thank you again for joining us this morning. I really hope that this is something that has been helpful to you all, and I'll make sure that I keep you guys engaged. I'll encourage Chair Brown to keep us engaged in this process and updated. Any thoughts, though?
I do have one thought.
Yes.
Just hearing more of these ideas for best practices and how to model good governance. We do have two policies we weren't able to get to today. But hearing in mind, thinking about who this is going to impact, how it aligns with the goals, it might be useful to have some feedback from the folks on the ground who are more familiar with these policies about what issues currently have people seen that could be a problem with sex discrimination, since that's one of these policies, whether existing policies seem to be effective, and whether there's any other ideas that could be considered for more effective ways to address it.
Okay. Okay. We'll look into that. I guess I want to think about too. This paradigm challenges us to think about what is the most honest nugget. Where are we really trying to go with this, in terms of identifying what those issues are? Is it that you're trying to make sure that we incorporate additional language that's much more accustomed to addressing what we need?
Well, just to back up, if we have an equity policy and now we're deciding a policy to avoid discrimination on the basis of sex, I would like to think holistically, where are the areas where our female students might not be able to participate in a program, or might face harassment which would interrupt their education? Is that a problem right now? What's the scale of the problem? What solutions are we currently using? And are there any other best practices that we could draw upon? And if there's any feedback from the folks who drafted this about what that drafting process was, why this particular language. I understand it probably aligns with current Title IX guidance.
This
from
is federal.
Yeah, exactly. But the federal rules set the floor and not the ceiling. So is there anything else that we can do to make sure that teenage girls who are facing dating violence don't have to, sit in the same classroom with their accuser if that makes them feel unsafe, and especially that they don't interrupt their education to keep themselves safe? So just food for thought. But if we're going to put these, identifying our values, measuring our programs and policies against those values, thinking about monitoring, making our decisions based on data, I think that we've moved towards that in a lot of ways, not just getting a policy on the agenda and considering it in a vacuum, but thinking why this policy, why these rules, how is this aligning with our values, is incredibly useful in the decision-making process.
I appreciate that insight, and particularly that example. So that, I think that helps frame it to me, because at the same time I'm thinking, oh, wait a minute, we've got sexual harassment, we've got discrimination policies well on the books already. But given that particular example, I think it helps me better understand what the motivation is. So thank you for that. If there's anything else, we are actually a little over time, but we started a little after time, and I'm okay with that. I thank you again for your contributions. Thank you for those who joined us. Again, we will meet again next month. What is our next date?
The second Thursday.
Second
Thursday of the month.
We are second Thursday of the month, 8:30 a.m. And again, because the governor did not relax the requirement for such bodies to meet online and be able to dispense duties online, we require folks to be here to have quorum at 3700 South High Street, Columbus, Ohio. I'm not sure about the zip. I don't know if this is 215 or not.
43207.
All right, 43207. Thank you so much. God bless you, and you all have a safe, wonderful day and week.